Hello, everyone. Following the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests in the States, much of the world is once again discussing the issue of racism. These protests have been successful in bringing to the forefront the concept of systemic racism. This concept tells us that racist structures are deeply embedded in every segment of social and political life. This includes even progressive institutions such as debate, or at least how debate sees itself. In this series of interviews, we want to explore how racism manifests itself in the debate community and what the community can do to dismantle those structures. We are very happy to have this conversation with a wide range of knowledgeable and insightful voices. And today I'm speaking with one of them, which is Esinam. Esinam is pursuing currently a master's degree in environmental policy at the University of Cambridge and completed her undergraduate degree at Kwame Nkrumah University in Ghana. Esinam, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Can you briefly outline what your connection to debate is? When did you start and why did you continue?
Okay, so I started debating in high school and then I continued during my undergrad years, and that is specifically from 2016 to 2019 back in Ghana. And of course, I think debate is a very interesting sport. I like the fact that through debate, I was able to challenge so many notions I previously had, and I like the fact that I got to meet new people and travel around the world as well. And so it was just an interesting for me to keep learning new things, and I guess that's why I stayed. Yeah.
Wonderful, and you're also quite well accomplished. I've heard that you've done. You of course were near tops of speaker tabs. You helped with hosting the West African Women's Debating Championship. So you've also spread that desire to continue learning and help set up very beneficial structures to increase debating in Ghana.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for women in debates, because then there's always this disparity between the number of men and women there. So I made it a point to try and sort of like just help other women coming up in the debate circuit. And yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Many people who listen to this show are from many debate communities around the world, but I happen to feel that the Ghanaian debate community isn't enormously represented on the world stage. So it might be interesting to hear a little bit as to like what does the Ghanaian debate community look like? How big is it? How many tournaments are there? And what are the structural obstacles for the Ghanaian debate community that you'd wish it sees and it can overcome?
Okay, so I think debate in Ghana is relatively new. I think it goes back to 2012. So it's still less than a decade old in Ghana. And there are about 4 major institutions that are always present in debate tournaments. But then over the years, we've tried to open up debating to other smaller institutions as well. So in terms of participation in West African tournaments and even African tournaments, I think progress has been quite good. We've attended the Pan-African University Debate Championship since I think 2013. And so it's been consistent. But then the problem is like breaking out into the world stages, right? The first Ghanaian team to attend WUDC was in 2017, which is quite recently. That was 3 years ago. And it's only been 2 institutions from Ghana that have been able to attend WUDC. And so there's still a lot more progress to be done in terms of the global arena. But when it comes to the West African debate space, we're quite a dominant force. And even in the African debate space, we've won the African tournament twice in a row, last year and the year before that. So I think you are quite good on the continental and regional level, but still a lot of work needs to be done on the global stage. Yeah.
Wonderful. So it sounds like actually by myself not having had to encounter many debaters from Ghana, I have missed out on some of the leading voices from the African continent in debate. And I can't help but wonder, do you feel that the inability for debaters from Ghana to break out on the global stage, is that part of the conversation surrounding race that we should be having?
I wouldn't tag it as racism per se, but probably maybe an issue of inclusion and diversity, probably. I wouldn't like to tag it as discrimination based on, skin color. But then, of course, there are certain structural issues that make it difficult for African debaters to make it on the world stage, right? So in terms of especially things like cost, in terms of things like feeling a sense of representation when we come to tournaments, like all those things have an effect on how well we perform and how long we're willing to stay within these spaces. Because I remember there was somebody who joined Cambridge Union before I did, the year before I came to Cambridge. And then when I asked the person about the debates in space in Cambridge, the person was like, well, it's just too difficult to fit in. So they wouldn't advise me to join because it was just not worth it, right? So over there, it's not an issue of racism per se, but just a lack of, inclusion and representation, perhaps. Yeah.
I think that's a very helpful suggestion in framing this conversation, in that
Yeah.
indeed what you're telling me is there's both our systemic efforts that we need to take towards inclusion, as well as looking how discrimination or direct interaction from person to person level, how they both can influence these kind of things. I'm intrigued by what you mentioned in terms of entering into Cambridge University. So entering into a wide space where you've met someone who said it's unlikely that these people would fully accept you there. Has it also been your experience? Could you maybe tell a bit more about that?
So I like to think I was probably more persistent than the other person. And so I decided to still give it a shot. I went for debate auditions and I got accepted into the debating team. And then I even had the privilege of representing the union at the World University Debating Championship. So, and the process was very fair to me, because then there was a panel that decided all these things. You get feedback and you understand how you could have done better and what you should have done. But then the problem is that aside, the inclusion when it comes to just debate wise, there's other things that need to be done to make sure that people are able to feel comfortable in such spaces. Because coming from Africa to UK, this is my first time being the only Black or one of the few Black people in like a majorly white space. So these things can be quite intimidating, and the cultural shock alone is enough to deter people or prevent people from performing as well as they did, right? So in terms of inclusion, I keep mentioning it, right? I feel like it's something that we need to pay particular attention to, especially when our institutions are, global or multicultural institutions. It's not enough to say, oh well, yeah, we allow a very fair process of debate, and it goes beyond that. Because if I'm not feeling comfortable, I don't feel like I'm included in a debate space, it's very difficult for me to attend tournaments and perform as well as like my European counterparts. So it takes efforts from both sides really, and I know it's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think the first step that can be taken in such instances is to at least make the effort to ask questions, right? Solicit feedback, ask people from different cultural backgrounds that how would you like us to help you feel included in such spaces? How different is your circuit in terms of debating, and how do you think we can make our circuit more inclusive? It's a lot of work really, but then it shouldn't always be the case where the minority group is the one, always asking the questions, because I felt that was my experience here. And it was always me taking the step, talking to people, trying to fit in, and it can be quite tiring. And it would have been nice to see effort from the other side, just simple questions, both through, formal conversations and informal conversations. So formal conversations at the institutional level, maybe create a feedback or questionnaire system where people from different backgrounds can talk about how to improve debating spaces, because you never know some things until you ask those questions. And then even just on one-on-one conversations, informally ask, how different is the African circuit? How different is the circuit you're from? And how can training be made more inclusive for you? What kinds of activities you think would make you feel comfortable in the debate space, right? So I think that's largely the problem. And of course, I admit there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but at least I'd like to see steps being taken to make it happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very important to say, because what you're saying here is that quite a few of the white space debate circuits and the debate clubs have the pretension of being race neutral or not seeing that race. But in that sense, what you're highlighting here is that it means that those communities aren't necessarily aware of what are potentially the best steps or the extra steps that we need to take to include debaters from certain different backgrounds. So concretely, what are the extra steps that, for instance, the Cambridge Debating Society can take to try and make sure that they can include more people? You say be like more aware of the fact that people are from different backgrounds, to offer the opportunity for giving that type of feedback. But what are the ways in which they could like restructure their recruitment or their training or their tournament selection to generally make people from different backgrounds feel more accepted?
Okay, so I think in terms of recruitment, I think the process was very fair. I was actually very surprised that I was new to the circuit and I still got accepted to represent the team as well at World. So I think it was a fair recruitment process, right? But then it shouldn't end after recruitment. It should go beyond just recruiting you and then leaving you to your own in the debate space, right? So I talked about things like having like a formal feedback system. So maybe include it like for the first week, have it like have something like a freshers week where you solicit people's experiences and what they would like to see, how they would like to feel better in those spaces. Because even though there's some form of activities for freshers who join, most of these things are Eurocentric and can be quite, difficult for other people who are not Europeans to blend into, right? So if there was a concerted effort during the first few weeks, because the first few weeks are really crucial, because then if you don't feel comfortable after 2 or 3 weeks, you just sort of like fall away. So the first few weeks should be more of a conversational time where we have some of these conversations happening in a formal way, just to make the new recruits feel like space that is at least trying to make sure that they're included. And I think that's like a big first step that can be taken. Yeah.
I think that's very good. It reminds me analogously to a conversation that's been going on in many debate circuits surrounding drinking, where quite a few people are highlighting that a large amount of the social life in European universities center around going to the pub, having lots of drinks. Yet there is a minority of people who, for whatever reason, refuse to engage in a type of behavior and they feel excluded. And indeed, what you're saying here is that we have more open conversations. We are more aware of those people existing and know what kind of like arrangements we need to take them into account. Yeah, very, very good. So when you've moved into this type of debating, so you say in the onboarding process within a club, there is a lot more that can be done in this type of conversation. Does that idea then translate as well to the wider community when you say go to tournaments or even to like global tournaments or local tournaments on the UK circuit?
Yes, I think so. I think these things should transcend the institutional level and also go to the tournament level. I attended the Oxford IV and I attended the Worlds in Thailand as well. And you realize like these things can be very fast paced. And of course, kudos to the OCOM for trying to make things like roll smoothly as they should. But then in organizing such things, like it'll be very helpful to keep in mind the fact that there are people that come in from diverse backgrounds and find ways of making these people feel more included in terms of even representation on like CAP, representation on OCOM, representation on equity panels. All these things have a role, a psychological role in how well a person feels welcome in any kind of space. In terms of social activities, how do we like solicit feedback to make sure that social activities at Worlds are not just focused on just one type of people? How do we make it more inclusive to other people? And again, of course, I admit this is a lot of work, but then like it just takes like tiny little steps. And also you realize that when the majority or the dominant group takes such steps, it's easy for the like minority groups to open up and then just spark a conversation. Because usually when the minority group feels like they're the ones that have to make the effort, or they feel tired at the amount of work that they need to do on their part to be included in such spaces. It can be quite frustrating. So at least to see effort from both sides would help generate a conversation, a much wider conversation that would be important in these kinds of things, right? Yeah.
I think this is very helpful, and indeed a very wonderful way of positing that lots of what the problem is, of course, is that there are minority or majority groups who don't consider themselves to be majority groups, who don't see what the problem is with the set of norms and behaviors that they've tended to incorporate, because they don't see them as norms and behavior itself, and becoming more aware of the fact that that always is the case. I think is a very, very good approach to highlight at every level down, and I think a very actionable approach. I think that's very good. Often case, and I think a difference in the way that you describe here the difficulty of including yourself in a majority white space, because very often when white people have conversations surrounding racist behavior, they tend to think of things as being like very explicit racialized tropes that they use against people. Is that something you've encountered in the debating sphere, or is it much more these kind of subtle behaviors that you've seen are the problem?
I think largely for me, okay, and I've been in the UK for 10 months and I haven't experienced any sort of overt racism in debating, but then that does not mean these things do not exist, right? And I wasn't at the World Debating Championship in Cape Town 2019, but then that's like a big example of how majority groups think because something is not explicitly racist, then it means there's no problem at all. Because then the issue with that tournament was that Black people felt disrespected because of one of the comments that was passed by someone on Ocom, and asked for, an apology to make things better. But then the response there was to try and, explain, try and make things look like it's not explicitly racist and so it's not a problem. And so what you do in those kinds of situations is that you create a notion that whenever any racist incident occurs, the society or the community is not willing to take adequate steps to respond to it effectively. It took a lot of protest. It took a lot of conversations for a private apology to even be given first, before then a public apology by the CAP team. And then, so you see, those things like foster some sort of perception that these groups do not take things seriously. Sometimes people don't talk about certain things because they are scared about the reaction that they get. So at least if there was a sense that racism would be treated with the kind of urgency or the kind of seriousness that it should be, then things would be probably a lot better. You'd have a lot more people calling out things like this. But a lot of times people just keep quiet about it because you don't want to risk sounding like you're paranoid. So you'd rather not say anything. But then the responses to these things really play a role in how people feel. And I think that's something that should be important. Like, that's something that should be worked on. Like, how do we respond to racist incidents? Do we ask people to explain? Do we try to, justify those actions? Those things, all those things really count.
Very good, very important. Yeah. So what you're highlighting here, then, I think, as a truly learning opportunity is, if I recall the incident myself, the scenario here was that a white person spoke with quite invective tone towards a Black person, and she treated that as being not necessarily to do with the color of their skin, because they are quite harassive towards other persons as well. Not taking into account the obvious legacy of white people tending to speak down to Black people, certainly in Southern Africa. And therefore, I think what you're telling us is that the context changes if you are in a global community, and therefore the way in which you address language changes well. And I think furthermore, what I really get out of your conversation, I think is very good, is that we need to learn that when someone tries to teach us that they operate in a different context, therefore should be a moment to learn and reflect and apologize, rather than try and tell them that the context in which you personally have always operated in should be the correct context to see, and be less defensive. I think that's very, very welcoming. Do you feel something similar could be said, for instance, about the tropes and the way that, for instance, many people in the developed world portray the developing world, or portray people living in poverty, say, in the global south as well, that we need to also learn to change the way that we talk about these scenarios to avoid using unfortunate racialized tropes?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. And of course, it's not an easy task to try and move out of your comfort zone and try and understand how things are done in certain contexts. But it's always important, especially when you're dealing with other people, because then as I think we've both said, racism does not always manifest in, explicit tropes and whatever you. It's just, subtle things like this, like thinking that okay, if someone is from Africa, and so that means they're from probably an impoverished country with, little amenities, like things like that, and then the way we deal with those things are more complex. And so there should be an understanding that let's first take the step in, trying to learn and understand how to behave with other people from different cultural contexts. And I think that's like an important first step that needs to be taken. I can't speak to explicit racism because I haven't experienced it personally. Maybe somebody who has been in the circuit or the debating space longer than me would have different experiences. But then I personally haven't come into contact with, overt racist remarks or anything of that sort. So I can't really speak to that, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think what you do highlight that I think is very important is that it's just deeper than just thinking about things as being explicitly about racist things, but that it is indeed about the inclusion of people who have historically have had fewer opportunities to engage within global debating, or people who come to different debating circuits and making these transitions easier. I think it's important indeed that you highlight as well that there's lots of learning there. At the same time, you tell us that that learning obviously should not just fall upon the minorities, especially pushing towards education the majorities who were blissfully unaware until then. Are there any concrete steps you can think of that could help majorities to make them more proactive in their learning? Are there resources they could share? Are there behaviors they need to adapt in?
I think it's more an issue of course, it's very difficult to, once you're comfortable, it's very difficult to take necessary steps to try and understand how people on like the other side experience things. But then again, I think it starts with the willingness or the open-mindedness. So in responding to or in meeting people from different cultural backgrounds, especially when you're in a position of power, maybe you're in OCOM, you're on the CAP team, or you're on the organizing team or something of that sort, try and, be open-minded to reach out probably to people of minority groups and ask them, in our preparation for this tournament, how do you think we can make things more representative? How do you think we can make things more inclusive for people in these kinds of spaces? Because I realize that when it comes to representation on CAP teams, like there's an effort to make sure that CAP teams are very diverse. But then that does not necessarily mean the competitions ends up also being very diverse, because I feel then the problem there's a lack of communication. Because then if the reason for representation is so that people can contribute ideas to make competitions or debate spaces more inclusive. So it's not just enough to appoint someone on a CAP team or OCOM or equity team from diverse backgrounds. Engage those people in active conversations. And I think feedback is something that is really very necessary, very important in debating. Apart from the feedback we get from judges, I think feedback in terms of these conversations is also very important. And I think it's something that should be probably institutionalized before each tournament. Could we have a feedback system, a questionnaire system that makes sure that we are soliciting responses from the people who would likely participate in these tournaments and how to make these things better for them? And I think that's like the major important first step. Because if you don't have enough information, you wouldn't be able to react well in such situations. You wouldn't be able to take adequate steps to make sure people are being included, and you assume things are okay, but then they're probably not, right? So that's the important thing I'll talk about, like learning and sparking conversations, getting feedback from the people who feel excluded in these kinds of things. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's indeed once again a useful addition. So one of the things I'm learning from this is that it's indeed not enough, as you say, to just have someone, say, from Ghana on a CAP team when there is then either this person doesn't really serve a role in explicitly in promoting other debaters from Ghana or West Africa or the African continent, or when they are the only person there and there aren't, for instance, then more people who are invited as independent adjudicators from the same region to really pull through. I think that's a very important contribution as well. You mentioned earlier that one of the difficulties for stepping towards these institutions is that people are afraid of not being taken serious. Do you feel that representation, for instance, on equity teams is sufficient? Or are there other steps that need to be taken to make sure that people are actually willing to come forward if they feel that there has been an unfortunate incident happen to them?
I think there could be a lot more that could be done about equity team. I feel maybe I don't know how to, I'm trying to phrase this very well. Probably make equity more, play a more important role in terms of tournaments, right? People really do not take equity teams seriously because there are really no sort of punitive measures attached to certain things that happen. So it's just like, okay, yeah, you took the matter to equity, we try and investigate, and then it just fizzles out. I haven't really seen equity teams being able to take certain actions to correct certain things or to call out certain, like, okay, yes, there's instances of calling out, but then it's not really enough, right? So I feel like there can be a revision of the way equity teams operate to make sure that they're taken seriously in debate spaces, because I don't think a lot of people mind being brought before like the equity panel anyways, because at the end of the day, it's not going to affect their role in the competition. It's not going to affect anything else that happens afterwards, right? So once that there's no sort of like or I don't want to say punitive, but no sort of resolution attached to the work that equity does, it becomes difficult to take the role of equity teams very seriously. Another thing also that is important for equity teams is representation, right? If something happens to me and I feel it's racist or I feel it's sexist, I'll probably be more comfortable speaking to an equity team member who is probably female or Black, because then I feel that person can understand me. I've had, I think that's one thing that stops people from reporting incidents that happen to them, because sometimes you stop and think like, am I really overreacting? Is this really racist? Who do I talk to it about it, right? So that kind of representation kind of make things better for people to be able to come forward, because they know that, first of all, there's somebody willing to listen to them and understand them. And then secondly, that specific action to be taken to remedy like whatever wrong has occurred. Yeah, and I think that's.
I think that's a very important subject to your approach here, especially because I have indeed a feeling that equity has become a catch-all term for everything to do with inclusion. And as you highlight, of course, is there's different elements that need to be approached, where currently equity, for various reasons, I think, seem to be working primarily on a mediated structure where they are talking about an individual vis-a-vis an individual who's done wrong, and try to encourage that on an individual level. Maybe someone goes apologize, as you point out. It might be inconclusive, because what does equity do next if the person is unwilling to apologize? But it also isn't currently very capable of translating from what happens if not an individual, but rather a community feels aggrieved in a certain way, or how can it do more general call outs if in a 20-room debate competition, 10 rooms, people have deployed unfortunate racialized tropes. How do equity engage in a very meaningful set of learning other than just a simple call out that people can ignore coming from the stage? So I think you're highlighting here a very important discussion into how we can further equity in development.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I like the fact that you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
I think we all have to be open, and part for me for these kind of interviews also, I am learning myself coming from a majority white perspective. So in that sense, these interviews are for me also a very personal moment as well. What I'm also very interested in maybe related not necessarily to racialized structures per se, but at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned how you furthered the work of introducing debates towards women back in Ghana. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What did you do there? How was it? How successful was it? And what were the causes for success? Because I think we can learn from something like that as well.
Okay, well, I think would I classify it as success? Well, yeah, in some regards, I think some of these things have been successful. So what I tried to do first was in my institution to create a woman-only space for training and sharing of resources, because it felt like, again, with the problem of inclusion, like the debate space back home was quite male dominated, and so it made more people feel left out, realize. And there was a recurrent problem, like I think I realized it in my second or third year, like there's so many females that sign up to join the debate team, and then after a year or a few months they all just drop out, and then it's still the men that keep going forward. And so by the time I was in my final year, I was the only female from my batch who was still active in debate. And so I tried to create, a female only debate space, try and share resources, helpful resources, because some people don't know where to find some of these things, and sometimes you just need help identifying important debate resources. I try to inculcate, more intensive training for women within my circuit, right? It was quite, I wouldn't pat myself on the back. Of course, there's so challenges we face, but I think yeah. And I also tried to speak with more female debaters at a point, because I realized that there was little female partnerships, and so it's something I tried to do. And yes, so I think the West African, this was the second time we'd organized the West African Women's Open with Sham. The second time was when we had Shamila on board, but the first time I served on the CAP team as well, and it just created a sort of like safe space for people to talk about things that happened to them in debate and how to make things better. And for the second one, we sort of like institutionalized it. It was really great having like Shamila on board, and then we had Entin at a point joining us. We had Kamara also judging like a few rounds. So it's very nice getting feedback from like these people. And there was about 2 days focus on just training, like talking to these women about like specific challenges they face in the debate circuit, and how some of us have been able to overcome those things, and how they could probably overcome those things as well. So it's something they found very helpful, and it's something I wish to see continue. So of course we're making plans to make sure that it's something that happens. Yeah, so I think.
Yeah, that sounds like a superb initiative. So I'm trying to think, because I think there's a lot of like overlap in how we can do it for other minority communities as well. So I'm thinking of things like maybe the debate communities or debate clubs should look at their own universities and see where are there, for instance, minority spaces. Like looking at the Netherlands, where the predominant minority communities either are people from former colonies, like the Dutch Antilles and Suriname, or there are people who come from Muslim backgrounds. Very often they have also created their own clubs and societies, and maybe coming to them and offering debate education to them as well, as a stepping stone, so they don't immediately have to go into a more foreign space, but they are then coming to the foreign space, already knowing what debate is and what they can expect. Sounds like a fantastic thing, and very similar to creating safe women environments. And also I think what you do on a personal level, where you speak with more women, definitely sounds like a tactic that you want to replicate, where people should be aware of that when they choose the novice, for instance, they want to speak with as a development competition, that they don't just go for the novice that they think shows most quote unquote promise or whatnot, but make a very active effort to try and involve those novices for whom you've seen their characteristics are less represented at the higher levels in the debate club.
Yeah.
I think we're coming near the end. So what we always like to ask at the end of the conversation is, are there important things that we haven't yet discussed that you think we should have a definite room for in this conversation?
I think this has been quite extensive. I think I've said all the things I thought of saying, and even more things than I planned on saying. And I think that's quite good. And I just think, yeah, I think it's been very extensive. And so, yeah, you've been a good host.
Thank you very much. And you've been a very good guest. Thank you very much for joining us. This was Esinam Osei-Bonsu, speaking to us from Cambridge about how to be more inclusive as a debate club. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.
Bye.